Hi, this is Bob Corney, one of the three co-founders of Clearloop, along with my partners Lars Zapata and former Tennessee Governor Phil Bredesen. I'm pleased to be joined today by the author of a new white paper about Clearloop in our program called Solar in the Shadows Part 2, Clearing the Pathway for Private Sector Action to Accelerate America's Clean Energy Transition. Lars Kvale, we're really pleased to have been working with you and to have you here today. You've been involved in the environmental markets for quite a while, so why don't you tell us about your background and experience?
Sure. And first of all, thanks to you and your teams for inviting me to join you today and also do the work with you over the last couple of months. So I've spent, as you said, 15 years involved in renewable energy, carbon markets, policy, as all in the effort of trying to help drive the transition to a cleaner grid, as well as decarbonize the sectors across industry, energy, agriculture, and so forth. It's primarily been around the standard side, setting up markets, figuring out ways that private sector action can drive reductions or drive renewable energy, in addition to what may be mandated by policy from a federal or state level. That work has both been in the United States, but also international.
That's great. It's a perfect fit for us. We kind of sit between the carbon renewable energy markets, so it's great alignment. In the paper, you really sort of highlight that Clearloop is an innovative evolution of the current market. What really stood out to you about the program based on your experience and what you've seen in the market?
If you look at the US renewable energy market today, about half of the large scale renewable energy projects are built essentially because companies are signing up for long term offtake agreements for that renewable power. That's been a tremendous change in the market. That's something that did not take place 10 years ago. And it's primarily been through the invention of a contract mechanism called a virtual power purchase agreement, or VPPA. The problem with that, the downside of that, is that it's not necessarily simple to do, nor is it feasible to do for most companies. You have to have companies of a certain size and generally also with certain locations and energy demand characteristics. So on the other hand, if you're a company that's been looking to try and reduce your impact, or at least offset or neutralize some of your impact along with reduction efforts, you look to markets such as the ones around carbon offsets. Unfortunately, the way the carbon offset market has developed, it has not provided a real driver for renewable energy projects in the United States. So what Clearloop has identified through this little bit different way of setting up the transactions between the companies with an emissions footprint and the companies actually building the renewable energy is that you combine the simplicity of the carbon offset world with the clear and actionable additionality associated with a virtual power purchase agreement. So it's really allowing companies of most sizes to have a direct impact in getting new renewable energy built and reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the energy sector in the United States.
That's fantastic. The you said it better than we did, and we really appreciate you kind of highlighting that. As a new approach, we often get asked about things like additionality, assurance. You kind of dive into that in great detail in the white paper. Can you summarize that kind of shortly for us?
Yes. So what you're targeting companies that are looking to become more sustainable in their operations. And these are generally companies that are already taking efforts to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions across their supply chains, their activities, their processes, and so forth. But also realize that in the current marketplace, for some parts of their business, there is no solution that is zero emissions, at least not yet. So they may be working towards that goal by 2030, 2040, 2050. But in the meantime, they want to offset the impact of those emissions and those processes. And in that case, it's really important that if they're going to spend money to support the development of a new carbon project, that it matters, that is additional, that the greenhouse gas emission reductions that that project is contributing to are additional to what would have happened if they had not done anything. And that's where we come in with the Clearloop methodology on how exactly to do that. This is not a new concept in the carbon world, but the way that it's being adopted by Clearloop is really a little bit different than what has traditionally been done in the carbon market.
It was interesting that in working with you over the last couple months on the paper, you really highlighted the importance of time and the causal connection between the end buyer and the project, as a real signal of commitment. Really tell us a little bit more about that. Because I think it is an important concept that sometimes is lost.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back, not too much of a history lesson on carbon markets, but go back to the Kyoto Protocol and other concepts that people have heard around cap and trade. The concept of carbon offset came from that idea of having these compliance regulatory markets in different countries. And one of the ways to find the cheapest reductions was to use some of the money that companies would have to pay as part of the cap and trade to source new projects that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so generally, that's the vision of a very large tradable market where you have originators that can drive these projects and create offsets that then could be monetized in a market similar to a commodity for, corn or soy or something else. You would have a carbon offset commodity that will be transacted. And that works if that market is of a significant size and is stable. Unfortunately, what you've seen with the carbon compliance markets is a lot of changes when they set out. In certain cases, the markets didn't develop. As an example of the Kyoto Protocol, as an example. So as a project developer, it's been very difficult to finance your projects with the expectation of a given carbon price that you'll receive in a future compliance market. What Clearloop does is you shrink that gap between the project developer and the eventual buyer of the offsets. So by having the two of them meet at the very beginning of the project and having a transaction that happens up front, meaning that the buyer of the offsets provides the money up front to the project developer, the renewable energy project developer in this case, you're basically making sure that that is what's driving the development of this project. That's what's making it happen, right? Without that, the renewable energy developer would not be able to go out and build the project. Renewable energy projects, like many other carbon reduction projects, have most of the cost up front. And the minute you can put steel in the ground, you can get solar up, or you can get a windmill up and going, or whatever it may be, then that's going to reduce emissions over the lifetime of that project. By having a methodology like this that can get the financing directly to the developer in front of when the construction happens is really what determines and to a large extent demonstrates that this is a real additional project. And from a company perspective, demonstrates that indeed the money that I spent was spent on reducing greenhouse gas emissions in this electricity grid over the next 10, 15, 20 years.
Great. I think that there's often concern that, programs like ours would somehow go away or not be necessary if there is some form of cap. And while that's, a bit of a debate as to whether that will happen in a timely fashion to really address climate change, you kind of tackle that head on in the paper, and that's the issue of baseline. And could you briefly tell us a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, I mean, briefly, I think anybody who's involved in this market certainly hopes that there will be more consistent carbon and climate policy in the United States, for example. There are many different ways that can be done, whether it's around the cap and trade, carbon tax incentives, and standards, and so forth. But the point of what is being done here is by building these projects now, this helps accelerate that energy transition in advance of any kind of policies instituted by a state or by the federal government. And the way it's structured will essentially be additional to any climate policy. So as an example, if there's a mandate in a given region to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by, let's say, 2035, then what Clearloop is doing is that they're adding to that. It's 30% plus by getting more projects built, the way it's structured. And I think that's really important to understand. It's not instead of policy. This is really in addition to that policy that hopefully is forthcoming.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that given where we are in time and the crisis that we face as a global community, we need it all to happen. We need greater emphasis on all kinds of projects, whether they be natural solutions, renewable energy. I think that that's been the ethos from the very beginning of Clearloop. is really around the concept of how do we add to that? How do we accelerate action today for companies that are looking to go beyond what they've been doing and to provide solutions that makes it easier for companies of all sizes to do that. I think that another thing that really strikes me about your work and what it sort of dovetails with our first white paper on emissionality is really the idea of clean energy access in the United States. I mean, because of certain market conditions, solar is very concentrated in a few areas in the United States. Solar and all renewable, but there are great opportunities to do that. And I think that what your work kind of illustrated to us is that there is a strong technical foundation for what we're doing in terms of providing that level of assurance and accuracy. Um, when you look at the landscape of options that are available to companies, where does Clearloop fit into that option pool? I mean, when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's adding to the options, right? And I think it's really trying to address the gap in the marketplace. While reducing 1 ton anywhere, is equivalent to reducing that ton somewhere else, there is still a preference for also having co-benefits of associated carbon projects. So there's a natural tendency from companies to say we would like to do projects that are close to where we're located, close to where our customers are located, our stakeholders, maybe close to where we source our materials from. And we have an interest in having additional benefits, just as economic development benefits, by situating the projects in regions that maybe have been bypassed by by the policies that are in place or other incentives. And then finally, and that's what you bring up with emissionality, there's the idea of trying to build more projects where the grid is the dirtiest, and not just focus on where you have the highest capacity factor or the best natural resources for something like solar, as an example. So really, how do you get that highest impact? And again, this is not about saying this is this is it. There's only the Clearloop way, or other ways don't work. It really is about additional tools. And it's clear there's a gap in the marketplace currently where you have companies that want to drive the development of new renewable energy. They're not big enough. They're not, since they don't have the balance sheet required to go into a virtual power purchase agreement. On the other hand, they are not necessarily too enamored with going in and sourcing carbon offsets from a variety of different projects. But they are interested in renewable energy where they are.